time of World War I, southern Rhodesia was administered by the British South African Company, which had controlled it and northern Rhodesia since acquiring them through diplomatic and conquest means during the 1890s. The white population of southern Rhodesia stood at 3,606 by 1911, making it a majority of 3%, while northern Rhodesia was about 3,000 white settlers, less than half of 1%. With the company's charter due to expire in late 1914, most southern Rhodesians' public attention was focused on the issue before the outbreak of war. The settlers were split between those who wanted to back the continued administration of the charter company and those who wanted to advocate for a responsible government that would make Rhodesia a self-governing colony within the British Empire. Still others favoured the integration of southern Rhodesia into the Union of South Africa, while they were formed in 1910. Following the intervention of war, the charter was renewed for 10 more years in the early 1915. Before 1914, Southern Rhodesian police forces were actually British South African police forces, first raised in 1889 and reconstituted into a more permanent form in 1896. This paramilitary mounted infantry force was technically all of the country's standing army. Organized along military lines, it served in the First and Second Matabele's War in the 1890s, operated on the British side in the Anglo-Boer War in 1889 to 1902, and then it even raised its own Rhodesian regiment in 1904. By 1914, it comprised of 1,150 men, including officers. Reservists existed in the form of South Rhodesian volunteers, an all-white amateur force with paper strength of 2,000 men intended for mobilization against local uprisings. Few doubted the volunteers' enthusiasm, but they were not extensively trained or even equipped. Though perhaps this would be useful in Rhodesian bush skirmishes and bush wars, most observers agree that they would be no match for a professional soldier on the continental conflict of World War I or the Western Front. In any case, the volunteers' enlistment contract were bound to them by domestic service only. When Britain declared war on Germany on 11 o'clock, the 4th of August 1914, the British Empire, her dominions, her colonies, and her protectorates automatically became involved in World War I as well. Word of this reached the southern Rhodesian capital in Scollowberry during the night. So early on the 5th of August 1914, the company administrator, Sir William Milton, wired Whitehall. All Rhodesians united to devoted loyalty to the king and to the empire are ready to do its duty. A few hours later, the official announcement that the proclamation that all southern Rhodesians were now at war with German colonies and Germany herself. The Rhodesian Herald and Bulawayo Chronicle newspapers published special editions the same day to spread the news. It took about half a week for the word to reach the whole country, but jingoistic demonstrations began in major towns almost immediately on the declaration of war, the August the 5th, the same day. A few days after the war began, the chartered company formed the Rhodesian Reservists, an entity intended to accommodate many of the white men who were keen to put on uniform, as well as to make a start towards organizing what eventually might become an expeditionary force. Eminent citizens and elected leaders formed their own platoons, each bringing about 24 volunteers each, so 3 or 4 would put 25 men in the corps, so that is at least 100 men per at least town or company. Units representing the Caledonian Society, the Lancaster and the Yorkshire Society, the Legion of the Frontmen Society, and other local organisations mirrored the Pals battalions of Britain. Volunteers could opt to serve overseas on the Western Front or even Salonika, Gallipoli, within Rhodesia, which means basically they could go to Southwest Africa, they could go up the coast of Cameroon, German East Africa, German Central Africa, and basically the African campaign within Africa, or even locally as a police force. Around 1,000 had volunteered, and by 1913, all in all, they were sent out to where they wanted to go on the 13th of August 1914. The company suggested that the UK government might as well dispatch 500 troops from the Rhodesian Reservists to Europe to act as an all-Southern Rhodesian unit on the Western Front. But the War Office in London replied that such an expeditionary force would be more practically deployed in Africa within the South African forces. When the company relayed this message to the South Africans said they were happy to take in the Southern Rhodesians, but only if they enlisted independently to the existing Union regiments of South Africa. The company found itself in a weird, unusual position. They had an expeditionary force that nobody wanted. Unwilling to wait, some Southern Rhodesians would-be soldiers made their way to England to join the British Army directly. as individuals or in groups. By the end of 1914, about 300 men were on the way to England. In terms of fighting manpower, Southern Rhodesians' main contribution to World War I was actually fighting in the trenches on the Western Front, as the white Southern Rhodesians of this theatre would join the British Army separately, or at different times or under their own streams, as well as being connected to Pacific units or reservists. They were spread across dozens of regiments, including the Black Watch, the Coldstream Guard, the Grenadier Guards, the Royal Engineers, the Royal Marines, and many South African and many minority white African groups that were serving on the Western Front. During the war's opening months, Southern Rhodesian volunteers could not afford to travel to England, so they were assisted by private funds set up on Ernst Lucas Gust, a Scoresbury lawyer and Anglo-Boer War veteran who would organize an accompanying recruitment campaign for European service. Gust stopped recruiting at the company's request, and they created the 1st Rhodesian Regiment, an expeditionary force to South and Southwest Africa, in October 1914. As a rule, the white Rhodesian overseas combined stridently provided a pro-British attitude with an even stronger pride for Rhodesia. Many of them saw participation in the war, particularly in the distant Rhodesian formation, as a step towards the forging of a distinctive national identity, like those of Australia and other mature British dominions, and building a case for Southern Rhodesian self-government. The existence of an explicitly Rhodesian platoon in the KRRC ensured the regiments of the South Rhodesian public and attached many of the colony's volunteers who had arrived in England later in the war. In the time, the KRRC formed the future Rhodesian platoons that would form additional personnel. While the average Rhodesian colonial living on the frontier of the empire was less casually acquainted with a rifle, many Englishmen had never held one. At Sheerness, Bradley's Rhodesian platoon won a reputation for fine sharpshooting and set a regimental record score at the shooting range. Once posted in France in December 1914, the Rhodesian platoons almost immediately began suffering regular heavy casualties. Southern Rhodesian volunteers continued to arrive in piecemeal in England throughout the conflict, so Rhodesian formations on the Western Front received regular reinforcements in small batches, but because of casualties, they were normally concentrated in larger groups that often take few months to deplete Southern Rhodesian units to return to full numerical strength. A cycle developed whereby Rhodesian platoons in Belgium and France were abruptly decimated and were gradually built back up, only to suffer the same fate on the returning action. When the KRRC Rhodesian platoons took part in British offensive, they were recognized by the distinctive battle cry that the men shouted when they went over the top. Sometimes the British and German positions were so close together that the troops that went over the top on the front line could be heard from opposite trenches. One group of the Southern Rhodesians advanced before being understood in a situation of speaking in a mixture of Sunni and Sebelai, two African languages instead of English, because they're Southern Rhodesians, so to actually connect with the locals and communicate with the locals, they have to speak Swana and Sablili. Aiun Aiteriono Aisina Kazuza. Aiko Kerio Chadoa Adi Achadoa Kamotrio. Aisiku Anuna Aini Aizitia Kuti Azigua Zinga Kundiaka Paziga Ragu Panahane. The cold is frightening and terrible. It is snowing and freezing hard tonight, and it makes me yearn to be back home on my farm in Yanahina. A Rhodesian writes home from the First Battle of Ypres, 1914. Trench warfare was a dreadful ordeal for the soldiers, and the South Rhodesians, coming from the wide open vast fields of South Africa, had a particular difficulty getting used to the cold and the mud and of course the confines of trench warfare. Bradley reports that some of his men had contracted frostbite within 48 hours of reaching the trenches. Despite this, the KARC Rhodesians acquitted themselves very nicely to the situation in the eyes of their superior. Lieutenant Colonel Sir Edward Houghton wrote the history of the KARC and commented that the South Rhodesian contingents earned itself a great reputation of valor and good shooting. The Southern Rhodesians became especially valuable in the KARC, distinguishing snipers, grenadiers, Lewis gunners, and other specialties. While discussing the KRRC sniper section, Houghton singled out its Southern Rhodesian members out of their fine marksmanship, commenting that the assumption that they must be accustomed to big game shooting, particularly excellent in this system for snipers, and inflicted countless losses upon the enemy. So many South Rhodesians were withdrawn from the trenches for officer training that in mid-1915, Bradley appealed to the Scoresbury and Bulawanu presses to make more volunteers to replace the ones that are being commissioned. A platoon of Southern Rhodesians of the 2nd Battalion, the KARC, took part in the Big Push on July 1, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. On the Somme battlefield itself, Rhodesians were among the people at Deville Woods, which began on the 14th of July. This was where the South African 1st Infantry Brigade was as well, as some of the colonials actually blacked up and started emitting Zulu cries and battles and war dances. forces. Despite suffering casualties of catastrophic proportion, about 80% of the brigade personnel were killed, wounded or captured, as they took the woods and held it until they were relieved on the 20th of July 1916. By the time of its withdrawal, the South African Brigade originally had the numbering of 3,155 men, 123 officers and 3,032 other ranks. By the end of it, they was reduced to 19 officers and 600 men. Daredevil Wood was later described by Sir B.H. Lyndon Hart as the bloodiest battle hell of 1916. God knows I will never wish to see this horrible sight again. A South Rhodesian veteran wrote home to his brother and his home. At times I wish I could confess anything to get out of this terrible death trap and murderous place. German gas attacks were among the most traumatic experiences for the southern Rhodesians in Europe. Well, everyone that was faced with a gas attack. One Rhodesian survivor of the attack described a sensation like suffocating, slow drowning. The Germans used both disabling agents such as tear gas with more sensitive mustard gas and lethal chemicals like chlorine and phosgene. Though generally not fatal, gas attacks could cause extreme physical discomfort and pain, often to the point where the soldier lost consciousness from all the pain. Mustard gas in particular caused blistering of the skin, vomiting, internal and external bleeding, and the British issued gas masks, but according to Brandy, they did little to help the men. They could only breathe through the gas, but the injuries sustained from the eyes, lungs and nasal passages of the gas were often extremely debilitating and lasting, and remaining with the men for many years after the war. In July 1917, the KRRC Rhodesian platoon received a lofty praise from a senior British officer, who had described the colonials as such as absolutely first-class soldiers, the greatest gentlemen, even as bit as good soldiers as our old expeditionary force. Around the same time, the platoon of the Southern Rhodesians of the KRRC took part in the engagements at near Nieuwpoort in Flanders, as well as Nottinghamshire Regiment managed to push on the eastern banks of the River of the Yips. Another hefty artillery barrage to German infantry and marines charged the British positions and surrounded the Rhodesian platoon. Brutal hand-to-hand fighting ensued, and many of the men of Southern Rhodesia were killed and were taken prisoner. The Ballou Chronicles ran a eulogy for them soon after, comparing their last stand to Alan Winston's Shenanigan Patrol in 1893. Later in 1917, the Rhodesian Patrol of the KRRC fought the Battle of Passchendaele near Ypres on the west of Flanders, 1917. The Western Front continued to see Southern Rhodesian troops right up to the end of the war, including veterans of the 2nd Rhodesian Regiment campaign of East Africa. During the conflict later stages, the British Army sent out most of its Southern Rhodesian officers to the Western Front to promote the colony's benefits, hoping to encourage immigration there by British servicemen after the war. They also proved themselves at Salonika. They did the Battle of the Somme, but their main fighting force was in Southwest Africa, German East Africa with von Lettow-Boerbeek, and other such colonial possessions out in the Africa. The South Rhodesians again, my friend, especially when we do South Africa, and maybe the East African campaign if we had time. But I would do the East African campaign and the Salonika campaign and other campaigns like that, probably in another video series titled France or some wacky stuff like that. So the Rhodesians are gone, but they're not forgotten. But you know who else was part of Rhodesia? The native black population, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Hope you learned something about the white minority. Now it's time to learn about the black majority. Learn something.
We'll preserve this little nation for our children's children too.